Closer to home, the CBC can't seem to escape numerous trending spots on X for a second day after announcing a major cut to its workforce.
Well, I think, the cuts yesterday show how deep and problematic media crisis is. So the public broadcaster is affected by the loss of private revenues, which means that we also need to consider the entire landscape when we think about the future of CBC and Radio-Canada. And the situation is going to be the same for decades to come.
But today, the feds wouldn't say whether Ottawa will exempt the CBC from across-the-board budget cuts expected by 2026. CBC said yesterday they plan to cut 600 jobs and simply not fill 200 vacancies over the next year. In addition to the latest layoffs, another shocker last night on CBC's The National, the public broadcaster's president didn't rule out more bonuses this year for top executives when asked by the network's chief correspondent. A painful moment that has put Catherine Tate's name all over the internet. Take a look.
I'm just curious about something. I'm going to presume no bonuses this year. I mean, the Canadian Taxpayer Federation said a Freedom of Information request showed 16 million were paid in bonuses in 2022. Can we establish that that is not happening this year?
It's too early to say where we are for this year. We'll be looking at that like we do all our line items in the coming months.
So there's a chance bonuses could still happen at a time when jobs are being cut?
I'm not going to comment on something that hasn't been discussed at this point. So,
okay.
Let's welcome Christopher Waddell, professor at the School of Journalism and Communications at Carlton, who is also a former parliamentary bureau chief at CBC for 10 years. I want to begin with your reaction, Professor, to the cuts yesterday and that messaging we just heard from the CBC president last night.
Well, I guess on the cuts, it's not really much of a surprise. News organizations have been cutting for more than a decade now. Audiences have been disappearing. Advertising has been shifting to Facebook and Google, so they've been losing revenue. It started with what were newspapers, but then it moved to broadcasters, and we're seeing both in facing a variety of different problems at the moment, and the CBC is no exception. It's lost advertising revenue, it's also lost audiences, and it's also having trouble competing against the streaming services that are dominating much of what people are watching and seeing at the moment. It's hard to understand, based on the announcement yesterday, how the financial situation of the corporation is going to change in the last 4 months of the fiscal year, because their fiscal year ends at the end of March, so that they would suddenly have money to be able to pay bonuses. And certainly it doesn't do much for employee morale if you're refusing to rule out the possibility of bonuses for executives while you're laying off a big chunk of your staff. And I think what we're seeing from that announcement in part is an attempt by the president of the CBC to indicate that things are going to continue as normal, but it's very hard to lay off that many people and have things stay as normal. So there's going to be some dramatic differences coming up at CBC, just as we've seen other news organizations across the country have faced dramatic differences in cutbacks as they've laid off staff as well.
Professor, you also authored the book, The End of the CBC. Do you think these cuts were inevitable?
What we talked about is we thought it was time for the CBC to realize that the one area it should concentrate on is news and current affairs and information. And it can't compete with the streaming services because the streaming services have budgets that are 10, 15 times bigger for programming than the overall CBC budget. It can't compete on sports, and it doesn't compete on sports anymore. Its biggest sports program, Hockey Night in Canada, is actually owned by Rogers. Where the CBC can play a role, and we argue that public broadcasting remains very important in this country, but where it can play a role is in areas where private sector media has actually abandoned as well. And one of those, a significant one of those, is international reporting. There are virtually, except for the Globe and Mail, there are very few news organizations in this country that have any foreign correspondents at the moment that are Canadians. And we miss, as Canadians, when stories aren't told to us from the rest of the world through Canadian eyes. So that's one thing they could do. And we lay out a series of others in the book as well. But it comes down to focusing on certain aspects of news and information and saying we don't care about some other sorts of things. And also tied to that, getting out of advertising as well. Because once you get out of advertising, you change the mentality because you're no longer competing for eyeballs and for audiences. And that competition is designed primarily for advertising revenue. If you're not doing that anymore, you can do different things. And we think the CBC should be thinking about how it can help Canadian media rather than competing against Canadian media. So it's a pretty dramatic change, but it's a change that has to happen, and it's a change that's long overdue.
A major shift that would have an impact on Canadian journalism from coast to coast to coast. Thank you for your time tonight, Professor Waddell.
Thanks very much.